The cold settles differently in the Deep South. It seeps into the wood, the air, and eventually your bones. For David Hayes, the cold arrived at 1:17 a.m., a precise, chilling moment when the peace of his grandfather's old farmhouse was shattered. He wasn't haunted by a ghost. He was being stalked by a real person, someone who had watched his family for decades and who now had the keys to the house. The terror wasn't in the unseen, it was in the certainty that a complete stranger was breathing just inches away, waiting for him to open the door. David Hayes was trying to rebuild his life. His divorce had left him adrift, and with no other options, he drove south, settling in his late grandfather's isolated farmhouse near Fairhaven, Georgia. The place was 10 minutes outside town, a sprawling 10-acre property surrounded by dense woods. It was quiet, too quiet. The house was a relic. The wood floors creaked a complaint with every step. The doors were stubborn, and no matter how high the thermostat was cranked, the cold lingered, perpetual and unsettling. The first few nights were spent in quiet solitude, marked by the simple rhythm of unpacking and the peace of the porch. No traffic, just the wind and the owl calls. But on the seventh night, the quiet was broken. It was just after midnight. David was drifting toward sleep when he heard it, whistling. It wasn't a familiar melody, but a slow, broken tune, consistently off-key. It sounded like someone walking deliberately through the woods behind the house, whistling as they went. David dismissed it as a hunter or a drunken local. But the next night, the sound returned. Same tune, same time, but closer. David got out of bed, flipped the porch light, but saw nothing. Armed with a flashlight, he checked the yard. No tracks, no sound of anyone running off, just the whistling, fading back into the deep woods. The whistling became a ritual. It would start every night with unnerving consistency, precisely around 1:17 a.m. The exact minute was random, 1:15, 1:19, but the pattern was clockwork. David began to suspect he was being targeted. Someone knew he was alone and was deliberately terrorizing him. Days later, desperate, he called the sheriff's office. Deputy Miller, an old man who had served the county for decades, arrived. As David explained the chilling consistency of the time, the deputy got profoundly quiet. Miller looked David straight in the eye and said, "Your granddaddy used to call us about the same thing. Said someone was whistling around the property late at night, always in the spring. We never found anything. I figured he was just getting old. But now you're hearing it too?" The revelation was a punch to David's gut. He had no idea his grandfather had dealt with this for years. Deputy Miller advised him to keep all doors and windows locked and stay inside after dark. David did so, double-checking every latch. One night, he wedged chairs under the doorknobs, but the whistling only intensified. The unseen presence seemed to mock his defenses. One night, the whistling was behind the shed, louder than usual, as if the person was standing right outside the flimsy wall. David grabbed his flashlight and looked through the blinds, but saw nothing. He didn't dare step outside. The next night, the 3 long whistles came from the front porch, right by the door. The night after that, the sound moved inside. David swore it came from under the floorboards, like someone was in the crawl space, whistling up through the vents. He didn't sleep at all. The next day, exhausted and pale, David tore through the attic, searching for any clue his grandfather might have left behind. He found a box filled with old, brittle journals. His grandfather's neat handwriting detailed the ordeal. The whistling had happened every spring for over 10 years. He never knew who it was, but was certain it was someone watching the house. His grandfather confessed to sitting up with a rifle across his lap, waiting. Crucially, the journals mentioned the whistling only began after his grandmother died, when the old man was finally alone. David's memories of the countryside were of a different era. He spent the first 8 years of his life in a tiny village where the population barely hit 90 people. It was a close-knit community. Everyone knew everyone, down to the license plates of the few cars passing through. As a small boy, he and his friend, Kyle, were allowed to wander unsupervised. One hot summer day, David and Kyle were desperate for cold soda. A kind old woman preparing mint tea for her upcoming birthday called them over. She offered to buy them all the soda they wanted if they would fill 2 plastic bags with mint leaves. The boys eagerly accepted, but the sun was brutal and the mint was scarce. Frustrated and sweating, they had barely filled half a bag when 2 tall figures approached them out of nowhere. The men were tall, at least 5'7", giants to the 7-year-olds, and dressed identically in black clothes with large hoods and tight pants. They looked young, under 17, but their expressions were difficult to read. "Are you kids both alone?" Kyle looked at David, making a subtle hand gesture, signaling they should leave. But David, being idiotic and eager for soda, missed the warning. "Yeah, we're actually looking for some mint plants," David chirped, asking where they could find a bunch. He had a sudden flashback of one of the men smirking at their naivety. The second man crouched and patted David's head. Kyle instantly pulled David back, asking sharply, "Who are your parents?" In that small village, this was a request to identify the entire bloodline. Kyle clearly didn't recognize these strangers. The men avoided the question. "Actually, we've seen a big field of mints. You see that hill over there? If you want, we could lead you to the field and help you fill those bags." David recognized the hill. He and Kyle used to play hide and seek in its woods at night, but he had never seen a mint field there. The only things that grew were corn, grapes, and watermelon. Again, the lure of soda outweighed common sense. David nodded eagerly, pulling Kyle to follow. The men seemed satisfied and began to lead the way, walking further and further from the village. David felt his friend's hand trembling. The village soon vanished behind the trees. The forest was dense, and David realized there was no mint field. He was sweating, panic rushing through his veins. He realized something terrible was about to happen, yet he couldn't stop walking. Suddenly, Kyle whispered in his ear, the words razor sharp. "There's something wrong with these 2. Run." That was the last warning. Kyle immediately sprinted downhill, dragging David behind him. They could hear the 2 men curse and start chasing them. David screamed, tears blurring his vision, running with a frantic energy he didn't know he possessed. He somehow ran the 2 kilometers back to the village without a single break. The men must have stopped chasing them as they neared civilization. The old journals confirmed David's worst fears. He was not dealing with a hallucination. He called Deputy Miller again. The old deputy returned, read the journal, and looked genuinely nervous. "Be careful," he warned. "Don't open the door if you don't know who it is." That night, David stayed awake. He sat on the couch, the cold metal of a shotgun across his lap. He barely knew how to load it, but it was his only defense. At exactly 1:17 a.m., the whistling started again, but this time it didn't come from outside. It came from the hallway, inside the house.
David froze. The hallway light was off. He could hear the whistling moving closer, step by careful step. He stood up, aimed the shotgun, and screamed, "Who's there?" The whistling stopped instantly. David flipped the hallway light on. Nothing. No one.
He spent the rest of the night in a state of hypervigilance. 2 nights of silence followed, lulling him into a false sense of security. On the 3rd night, he went to bed, leaving the hallway light on. At precisely 1:17 a.m., he woke to a new sound. Knocking. Slow, measured, deliberate knocks. 3 of them. They were coming from the back door, inside the house. Silence! Then, the floorboards in the hallway creaked. Someone was walking. The hallway light flickered and died. David snatched his shotgun and stepped out of the bedroom. The hallway was pitch black, but at the far end he saw a figure. A person wearing dark clothes, a pale, indistinct face. They were standing perfectly still, watching him. David raised the shotgun, his hands shaking violently. He tried to speak, but his mouth was dry. He managed a shaky scream. "Don't move!" The figure slowly started to lift its leg, turning as if about to run. David screamed, "Stop!" In that moment, the figure darted out of the hallway. David heard the surprisingly heavy footsteps stomping out the front door into the darkness. He ran outside and fired a shot, low-key hoping he'd hit them in the dark. He locked up the house, drove his truck into town, and slept that night in the cab. The next morning, Deputy Miller drove out to the farmhouse. He found the front door unlocked. This confirmed the chilling truth. Whoever that person was, they had a key to his grandfather's house. Nothing was broken or missing. Deputy Miller recommended David change the locks and, off the record, suggested he move out. Someone out in those woods hasn't taken kindly to either your grandfather or yourself being in that house, he warned. David immediately drove to the local hardware store and changed the locks. He contacted his parents and a week later left the farmhouse to live with them out of state. It was months later, in his new urban life, that David learned the shocking identity of the intruder. He found out that when he was a child, his parents had hired a young babysitter named Sarah. She had a very disturbed ex-boyfriend named Marcus. Marcus had been stalking Sarah, and the investigation confirmed he had also been stalking David's family, believing they were still in contact with Sarah. Marcus admitted to police that he had been stalking the house. He learned about David because he saw the family leave their son with the babysitter. He planned to kidnap David, believing that because Sarah cared for the boy, Marcus could use him as leverage to force Sarah to come back to him. The police confirmed Marcus was the one in the ditch with an axe the night David was visiting his grandparents. The realization that the stalker who had haunted his grandfather for decades and who now had a key to his house was the ex-boyfriend of a babysitter from his childhood. A disturbed man whose motives were disturbingly personal left David profoundly unsettled. The house in Fairhaven was eventually sold. David Hayes escaped the whistling, the knocking, and the figure in the dark. But the central mystery remains unsolved. Was Deputy Miller right? Was the figure simply Marcus, a disturbed creep from the past who found a key and continued an old, decade-long harassment? Or was the whistling creature that stalked his grandfather something else entirely? A genuine threat that Marcus, the ex-boyfriend, merely used as a sinister cover? How did this dangerous individual gain access to the farmhouse key, an object of high importance? And why did the attacks cease immediately after David fired his shotgun, only to resume with a deliberate, patterned knocking? Was this a case of a human predator using an old family legend to terrorize the new occupant? Or was the terrifying whistling entity of 1:17 a.m. something far more ancient and sinister than a simple man named Marcus? Don't forget to like and subscribe